be here. And just a little bit about the organization. If you haven't heard of BCG, or Business Consulting Group, we do plenty of things with respect to preparing affirmative action plans. If any of you are federal contractors, we've got nearly 50 years of experience with that, but also doing things like test validation, studies, expert testimonies, in-depth compensation, pay equity reviews and analysis, which is something we've been very busy doing, but also with People Insights, doing things like analytics for diversity metrics, doing consulting work in that area, and training. But if you want to have access to any of our webinars and blogs, we do free webinars all the time. You can visit by going to that link, and you'll have copies of our handouts made available to you. But first of all, I wanted to say we're celebrating National Hispanic Heritage Month, and that goes September 15th through October 15th. So if you don't know a whole lot about it, it aims to honor the Hispanic community that has been thriving in the United States for generations. I myself am a second generation Hispanic. My father was born in Spain, and then he went to Cuba when he was a teenager with two of his older brothers, and all three of them married Cuban women. And then they came to the United States in the late 60s, as did many Cubans seeking political asylum. So this topic of Hispanics in the United States is very dear to my heart. So we celebrate during this month-long celebration the Hispanic community in the United States and the impact that they've had in the community and all their wonderful traditions. But it all commenced years ago, back in the 1960s, as a movement when we were talking about civil rights and equity in the workplace. So a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. We're going to do some differences in terms. A lot of times people aren't quite sure, do I use Hispanic? Do I use Latino, Latinx? What's the correct term? So we're going to go over that for a little bit. That should be fun. And then we're going to talk about a little bit about the current Hispanic population in the United States and what it's projected to look like. And we'll go over some jobs where Hispanics are concentrated or underrepresented. And Brian's going to talk about what is this pay gap issue looking like, and some ways to close that pay gap. And then I'll finish off by talking about some tips for attracting, hiring, advancing, and retaining Hispanics in the workplace. And so we do look forward to you putting questions in the chat there. We'll be taking a look at that. And, you know, any questions that you have or comments, please do share. We try to make this as interactive as possible. So we're going to start here. Let's see. I'm trying to see where we have a few polling questions. Let's see if I can get to this. Oh, I don't see the polling thing. Amber, do you want to launch the first polling question? Okay. So the first polling question is, the term Hispanic can be used interchangeably with Latino. Is that true or false? So what do you think?
Amber, you're on mute.
I just realized that. Thank you. So we're at 80% participated. Let's see if we can get to 100%.
Okay. All right. The term Hispanic can be used interchangeably with Latino. True or false?
All right. We're almost at 100%. Julie, I'll let you call it. You want me to end the poll?
Oh, you can go ahead and end the poll.
Okay.
So what are people saying, Amber?
All right. I'm going to share the results.
Okay. So 17% said true, 83% said false. So there is a difference between the two terms, although what's confusing is sometimes people do use those terms interchangeably. So we'll go into in a second what the definitions are. Let's look at the next polling question, Amber.
Okay.
People from Brazil are considered Latinos. So if you're talking to someone in the United States and they mention that they met someone from Brazil, are Brazilians considered Latinos? True or false?
Okay, it's going really fast. So I'll let a few more people answer. All right, Julia, let me know you want to call it.
Go ahead. Let's see what they say. 54% said true, 46% said false. So again, we're going to talk about what that is, but the answer actually is that people from Brazil are Latinos, and we'll talk about why that is. And let's look at one more polling question, Amber. Mexican refers to both language and nationality, true or false? So Mexican, the term Mexican can refer to both the language that someone's speaking as well as the nationality, true or false? And you can go ahead and show the results, Amber.
Okay.
All right, so true. So 97% said false and 3% said true. So this is something that comes up from experience. The answer is actually Mexican is referring to a nationality, or like the food from Mexico or things from Mexico can be referred to Mexican, but Mexican is not a language. So people from Mexico speak Spanish, but people have asked me before, do you speak Mexican? And the answer is no, I speak Spanish. Mexican isn't a language. So even like tortillas, it's funny, even tortillas, when I remember growing up, tortillas in Spain are actually an omelet. So if you talk to someone from Spain and you say you want to eat a tortilla, that's an omelet. An egg omelet has sausage in it, onions, different things like that. I did not know what a Mexican tortilla was, or Central South American tortilla, until I went to college and I was invited to someone's home and they were serving tortillas. But yeah, so be mindful of that. I don't get offended if people use a different terminology, because I know exactly what they're trying to say, but it could get a little bit confusing. But let's keep going, and we're going to introduce these terms and talk about a little bit more. But I wanted to introduce some quotes from some Hispanics that really resonate with me. And this one is from Juan Felipe Herrera, and he says, diversity really means becoming complete as human beings. All of us, we learn from each other. If you're missing on that stage, we learn less. We all need to be on that stage. And you know, if you've heard organizations talk about business case for diversity, it's really good for the organization to have diversity, to have people with different experiences, different types of viewpoints and things like that can really help with the bottom line, and can help to retain employees and for employees to feel respected and valued in the organization. So let's look a little bit on the terminology, and then we'll get into some statistics. Ethnicity versus race, we're going to talk about that. Spanish, the term Hispanic, Chicano, Latino, Latina, and Latinx. So the first one is ethnicity versus race. And this is a question I get asked a lot, especially for companies who are federal contractors and they have to prepare an affirmative action plan. They've got to make sure that they're asking their applicants to voluntarily self-identify race and ethnicity. So ethnicity is concerned with a group, cultural identity, or expression. So Hispanics, for example, would be considered an ethnicity. And so we have a commonality of the language, which is Spanish. So it doesn't matter if you're from Mexico, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Cuba, or Spain, we're all speaking Spanish. So it's interesting, when I was growing up, I thought that all Asians spoke the same language. And the reason for that was because I realized that all the Hispanics I was introduced to, which was a lot growing up with my family going to different events, they all spoke Spanish. Now they had different accents and they had different slang, but much like the United States and the UK, our accents are different, our slang is different. Even in the United States, you know, and I'm in New Orleans, we say Coca-Cola or Coke. If I go to a different part of the country, you might say pop or cola, but we understand each other. So ethnicity is talking about cultural identity, expression, language, but race is focused on physical and biogenetic traits. So that's the difference there. So if you're an organization that has to complete, for example, the EEO-1 report that annually needs to be submitted to the EEOC, you know that the different racial categories that they're collecting include white, Black, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, Asian or American Indian, or Alaskan Native. And they also have a designation for 2 or more races, but notice it says Hispanic or Latino. And then it says include all employees who identify with more than one of the above 5 races and who did not answer yes to the question, are you Hispanic or Latino? So if I were, for example, to say that my race is white, but my ethnicity is Hispanic, it would default to Hispanic. It would not be counted as 2 or more races. So that's something to be mindful of. As far as terms, so a person who is Hispanic is a person who is from or has ancestors from a Spanish-speaking territory or country. So that would be Spain, that would be Puerto Rico, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Mexico, Central America, and most of South America. Now, when we talk about Latino or Latina, it's a person of Latin American origin or descent. So when we're talking about Latin America, we're talking about Mexico's included in that, Central America, South America, the Caribbean islands. And so it's talking about that area, which would include Brazil, because Brazil is part of South America, part of Latin America, even though people from Brazil speak Portuguese. Now, what's confusing is some people in Brazil are Hispanic. So they might have been from a Hispanic Spanish-speaking country and moved to Brazil. When we talk about Chicano, it's people of Mexican origin living in the United States. And you want to be careful with using that terminology because sometimes people use that terminology as a derogative. So you want to be mindful of that. Now, Latinx, we're going to talk about in a second. I have a hard time saying that word. My Spanish accent comes out, but gender neutral form of Latino, which is very interesting because if you say Latinos, the plural, that is gender neutral. It's referring to men and women. The Latino, if you're referring to a person, Latino, that's the masculine, Latina is the feminine, but Latinos is referring to men and women. In Spanish, if you say someone is Spanish, that's belonging to or belonging or relating to Spain or its people, language, or culture. So I can say my father is Spanish and my mother was Cuban because she was from Cuba. So a little bit about statistics here. As far as identity, 54% of Hispanics who were surveyed, this is part of the Pew Research Center, prefer to use their nationality to identify themselves. So if someone asks you, what are you? I mean, that's not exactly the nicest way to ask someone, but sometimes, somebody might say, where are you from or what are you? And they would identify and say their nationality instead of saying Hispanic or Latino. And interestingly enough, 66% of people for Dominican Republic prefer to identify as nationality as opposed to saying Hispanic or Latino. And 63% of people from Cuba also prefer to say their nationality, which would be Cuban, instead of saying Hispanic or Latino. 20% of Hispanics choose the term Hispanic Latino to identify themselves, and 23% of Hispanics simply would state that they're American if someone asked to identify themselves. As far as using the term, a survey was done through the Pew Research Institute that asks Hispanics, do you prefer to use the term Hispanic or Latino? 50% of Hispanics surveyed said they had no preference on how they were referred to.
It's only an hour, so
33% preferred to be called Hispanic, while 15% preferred to be referred to as Latino. And I found this to be interesting because the Pew Research Institute also asked Hispanics about the term being used Latinx. So only 3% used the term Latinx, and they were mostly the younger generation, mostly female. And as you see here, 20% do not use Latinx at all. And then 76% never even heard of the term Latinx, which it's interesting because even if I ask members of my own family, a lot of them have never heard this term or don't understand why people want to start using this term. Because again, when you say Latinos, that is basically gender neutral because it refers to either female or male or female males mixed together. So I thought that was interesting.
Hey, Julia,
Go
real quick,
ahead.
there was a couple people that had a question about Latine, so Latine, and people preferring that in the LGBTQ plus community. Have you come across that?
With the E at the
end?
end? Okay, so see, you're educating me because that's not something that I'm familiar with. I am familiar with the Latinx, and a lot of that is people who not gender neutral, but gender identity neutral as well. So you're educating me. I'm not familiar with that. If anyone wanted to put a comment, if they are familiar with that and how it's being used, that would be good to know. So it's interesting. Sometimes people that come up with new terminology aren't from the group itself. And so especially if you're talking about people that are first generation in the United States, they're not very familiar with these movements going on in the United States. So if you talk to like my father or aunts and uncles, it's not something they're familiar with. And it's not something that I heard it with the ending of E. So that's interesting. If anybody has some information they can share in the chat, that'd be great. Thank you for that. U.S. Hispanic population, you can see that it's growing tremendously. Hispanics are the largest minority in the United States. 62.1 million Hispanics in the United States. 19% of the total population are Hispanic, and 62% of those who identified as being Hispanic identified as being Mexican. Puerto Ricans and Cubans are the next two largest populations in the United States. And then here it just gives you a little bit about what the population is expected to be. And if you look, it shows you in blue is the 2014, and then 2060 is what they're projecting the Hispanic population to be. A lot of that is birth rate amongst Hispanic families compared to other groups, where we see people who are white having fewer children, while people of different other classifications having more children, and Hispanics being one of those groups that's growing largely. As you can see there, look at the population that's expected to be in 2060. And a little bit about Hispanics in the labor force. Hispanic workers in the labor force have grown from 10.7 million in 1990 in the United States to 29 million in 2020. So huge growth we're seeing there. Hispanic proportion of the workforce has increased from 8.5% in 1990 to 18% in 2020. And we're seeing that the proportion of the workforce is projected to account for 1 out of every 5 workers in the labor force. And Brian's going to talk a little bit more about what jobs we're seeing Hispanics in, and where we're seeing that Hispanics are lacking in the workforce. So the Hispanic labor force is projected to reach 35.9 million in 2030. The median age of Hispanics in the labor force is 38.5 age as far as years old, compared with 42 of the entire population. And we're also seeing that as far as education, we're seeing Hispanics are more educated and things of that nature, and more are completing high school. So it's going to be interesting to see what positions we're seeing Hispanics in the next 10, 20 years. A little bit about occupations here. 4.3% of executive positions in the United States are filled by Hispanics. So we're not seeing, even though Hispanics are the largest minority group in the United States, we're still not seeing a whole lot of numbers of Hispanics in those high-reaching positions. 2.7% of Fortune 1000 directors identified as being Hispanic. And see here, you'll see occupations with the highest concentration of Hispanic workers. I think for some of you, this might not be very surprising, but when I actually saw the percentages, I was like, wow, look what we're looking at. 43% farming, fishing, and forestry. So we do see a lot of Hispanics in those cultural, working farms and things like that. 37.9% in building and grounds cleaning and maintenance types positions. And then we're seeing a lot in the construction field, food preparation, and transportation and material moving. So now what I like to do is I like to turn it over to Brian, who's going to talk about this whole pay gap issue and what that looks like. And, are we paying Hispanics unfairly?
Yeah, thank you, Julia. And good segue on your previous slide there. I think the statistic was 4.3% of executives and 2.3 or something percent of officers, et cetera, are Hispanic. And that's really what we're talking about here with our pay gap issue. I think, in the poll, I don't want to clog up the chat with it, but, a lot of people have heard of the pay gap, but I think there's a common misunderstanding in terms of what is the pay gap really, and then how do we go about closing that gap? Because the media, per usual, tends to lead us down a path that may not be very productive in actually addressing the problem that we've got. So that's my goal for this short section here, is to try to educate a little bit on kind of what is the pay gap, what does it actually look like? And then why is it there? And what do we do about it? All right. So, this is just an example. You can Google it. But, currently there's a massive pay gap, even just by gender. Male, female, typically it's about, on average in our country, females earn somewhere between 80 to 82 cents to every dollar earned by males. This is just a snippet regarding Florida. In Florida, that is then compounded if you are Hispanic. So Hispanic women are really earning about 60 cents for every dollar earned by a white non-Hispanic male. That's about a gap of $20,000 a year. And this is everywhere, really. You look in any state, you're going to see this kind of trend. And so on a national level, Hispanic or Latin women are earning 53 cents to every dollar earned by a white non-Hispanic male. All right. So no matter how you slice and dice it, Hispanic females are the most disadvantaged group from a pay perspective in our country and in most organizations out there. Now, again, I think people kind of jump to the conclusion, okay, female Hispanics are being discriminated against. They have, lower wages across the board. Every organization is, underpaying them. And that could be partially true. But there's a little more digging that we need to do. Before I get past this, just to give you a sense of what it looks like, for all races here, for males, and I'll show you by females as well. I'm a big numbers guy, but I'm going to try to keep numbers out of the discussion after these couple slides here. But this is showing us basically the trend of, the median annual earnings. And again, this is broken out for the male by race. Okay. So we've got our top blue line there jogging across. That is our Asian men group. The blue line right below that is our white men. Below that is our Black men, and below that is our Hispanic men. So here over in 2020, when this was last collected, you can see on average our Asian men are earning about $84,000 a year. White men on average are earning about $60,000. Black men earning about $50,000, and then Hispanic men earning about $43,000, call it. Okay. So that's a pay gap right there. That difference that you see in these points, upwards of $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, that's the pay gap. Now, note that it's just an overall median, or you could think of it like average, right? Just an overall average difference between all the Hispanic men versus all the white men in our country. Okay. And that's informative. It tells us a lot of information, but we got to dig deeper to really figure out why is that happening, and how do we close that gap? How do we get things a little more level playing field? All right. So we get the same issue going on with our females. When we break it out by race, you can see it's the same pattern. Asians earning the most, white, Black, and then Hispanic women at the bottom there. Now, if you cross these two charts, we've got Hispanic women earning on average $37,000, and then I'll flip back, compare that to white men, for example, earning $60,000. This is where we see this massive gap. This is why there's women earning 53 cents on the dollar compared to their white male counterparts. All right, so we know this exists. It's a problem. Now I'm going to try to clarify a few things that I think will help us address it moving forward. All right, so there's one other major term that's out there right now in the world of workplace equity, and particularly with compensation in organizations, and that's pay equity. So pay equity and pay gap are really two very different concepts. Okay, and it's important to understand them because if you try to address the pay gap incorrectly, you're going to cause inequity in your organization. Okay, so what we're talking about with pay equity is really differences in pay, all right, when we're considering a number of other factors, right? So the pay practice, things that are factored into pay, like somebody's time in the company, time in job, geographic, cost of living adjustments. If you live in the San Francisco Bay Area versus Des Moines, Iowa, cost of living is very different. So there's a lot of factors that we try to remove out of the equation before we say, okay, now what does it look like between men and women, or Hispanic and white, or whatever groups you want to compare? All right, so pay equity is there's a statistical study that we do that removes all these other things and says all else being equal, the job title, the nature of the work performed, all these other factors, is there discrimination there? Are we paying males more than females or whites more than Hispanics? And so we do a lot of work in that realm, and there are still differences. We flag them on a daily basis and tell organizations, hey, you're discriminating, whether you know it or not, you've got pay bias here. Okay, now that's very different than just what we talked about on the last couple slides, which is that pay gap. Okay, that's just, the pay gap is really just a simple comparison of average pay for men versus women or Hispanic versus white, et cetera. All right, and that nationwide pay gap is really just a simple comparison of those two groups against each other, right? So that's what we call an unadjusted. All right, so even if you look in your own company, your organization, have your comp team do it, say, hey, tell me what the average male versus average female salary is. You're going to see that roughly 80 to 85 cents on the dollar that women are earning compared to men. However you want to slice it, you're going to see these raw pay gaps, so to speak. Okay, you can get a little bit better view at it by looking at it simply by job title, or even like, within a category of jobs, like, hey, at our manager level, how does it look male versus female or Hispanic versus white? Okay, so there's more nuanced ways you can do these kinds of analyses, but really you're not factoring in a lot of other things that actually go into these pay decisions. So the pay gap is really a pretty, kind of a blunt instrument that you can look at to see, okay, on average, how do things stack up? Now, if we really want to close that gap, it's not necessarily a monetary issue. All right. It's not just a matter of paying people more in these lower paid race or gender groups. Okay. So again, the media tends to focus on these unadjusted pay gaps, and that really focuses everybody's attention on just simply dollar amounts, right? Like, okay, we need to just increase our female and Hispanic pay in our organization. That's going to close that gap. It's not that simple. All right. And that actually may lead to pay discrimination. So again, thinking of the pay equity situation, or more simply, the adjusted pay gap, if you look at it by job title, typically we don't see these massive pay gaps when you compare, managers, right? Your Hispanic managers to your white managers, they're not going to be earning 60 cents, 70 cents, 80 cents on the dollar. You're going to see it more, upwards of 95 cents, or even sometimes right at 1-to-1. Okay, so if you all of a sudden just artificially say, all right, we got to raise the average pay for our Hispanic population or organization, everybody's getting 10% raise across the board. Now you may have potentially just created a pay inequity situation, because for equal work, those managers that are Hispanic are now going to be making 10% more than the white managers, and that's not necessarily going to be equitable and fair. Okay, so there's more to it than just increasing the amount of money we're paying people. Okay. And really the problem that I'll get to is going to be more in your workforce development. I'm going to ruin my own surprise with the rest of these slides, but I can't hold off anymore. So it's really more about developing your workforce, making sure you're recruiting, hiring, promoting, and doing a better job in those areas. All right. So really the big question, if you want to close the gap, is, not how do we close the gap? It's really, why is the average salary for our Hispanic and females so much lower than their counterparts? What is it that's causing that salary difference? All right. So when we do that, there's a number of other questions again here that we should kind of be asking, okay, is it just a matter of these one-time adjustments? I kind of went over that. It's not going to resolve the root cause. It's going to result in pay discrimination. Okay, maybe, hey, we just, we are underrepresented in these higher paying positions. Let's just hire exclusively for Hispanics until we get things back up to par. Hiring exclusively for any protected group characteristic is going to be discrimination. All right. Can't do that. And it's not sustainable. You need to build what we call like feeder lines or feeder programs, where you've got minorities in any category scattered throughout your whole range of jobs and your pay grades, et cetera, so that as soon as you promote somebody up, you promote a minority up, it gets backfilled by more. It's more about the way people are going to move into your organization and then up through your organization that's going to help close this. Okay. So there's a few tips here. First of all, this is a highly sensitive topic in a legal sense. And again, that's kind of the world that I swim in on a daily basis. And I'm happy to be here talking with you all who very likely don't do that. Julia's not necessarily in that space either. And it's good to break out of that world once in a while. But, from a legal perspective, there's two things you need to be mindful of is the utilization of your available workforce or labor pool that's outside your organization. You may be trying to find Hispanic individuals for your executive positions, but again, if you live in an area, northern Minnesota, you probably don't have very much of a labor pool to choose from. You're not going to be able to find a lot of Hispanic executives, in the Duluth metropolitan area. So first things first, take a look. If you have a compliance, kind of program or in a voluntary affirmative action plan or a diversity plan, you can pull census data in, and Julia is going to talk a little bit about this later, but you can pull census data in and see in our area, do we even have the opportunity to pull, minorities and people of color into our organization. And the second thing would be doing a true pay equity study. In order to close the pay gap, yes, there's other things we should be doing, but you should also make sure that you've got pay equity in your organization, that you don't have, discrimination or bias in your pay processing. It's a rampant issue, and there's very complicated ways that we can go about looking at that, it's unintentional bias or discrimination that's happening, but certainly that's not helping the situation, right? That's only going to hurt you as you try to close the gap. So doing a pay equity audit on your comp system would be advised, at least, for starters. All right, so the goal is really to create sustainable change. And what that's going to require really major changes to your practices and procedures in how you bring people in and up through your organization. So again, that concept of these feeder lines upward. All right. So control what you can control. You can't always control what the labor market looks like in your area, but you can control how people are moving up through your organization and giving them opportunities. All right, so a couple steps to improve the workforce composition in your organization. Numbers 1 through 4 there are really what we call a utilization analysis. I'm not going to dive too deep on those because we will talk about that momentarily with Julia again, but the concept there is that you've got to look externally at the labor pool and then look comparing to your own organization. Let's say you've got 5% Hispanic availability for managers. All right. Do you have about 5% Hispanic managers in your organization? Well, if you've got 10%, you're overutilizing. You're doing even better than what the labor pool has. Or if you have 0%, you've got some work to do. We don't have any Hispanic managers yet. There's 5% of the workforce in our area we could bring in. So points 1 through 4 there, utilization analysis. It's a very helpful way you can go about checking yourself against the available labor pool. Looking at your applicant patterns. Are you getting enough applicants of people of color and diverse applicants? Same thing with hiring. Do you have kind of a differential rate of hiring for different groups? And you can even look at intersectionality there. Like, how does who's got the highest hiring rate, right? Let's say it's white males. That's typically the case. Okay, they're at 70% of our white males are being hired in the process. Okay, now we only have 20% of our Hispanic females that we're bringing in as applicants are being hired. Yikes, right? We've got a massive disparity there. Why are all of our Hispanic females dropping out of our hiring process? Is it a test that we're using? Is it an interview? Some other procedure or practice in the hiring that's causing that? Same thing for promotions and transfers. Look at these rates of promotions by all the different groups that you've got. And that can be really eye-opening into telling you, where do we have some work to do, and maybe where are we doing okay? All right. So real quick, breaking down, just another kind of source of the pay gap, which is really the workforce distribution. Where are your minority or non-white employees located within your pay scale, essentially? So here's a fictitious organization, 60% minority, 40% white. On the whole, you'd say, nice job. Wow. That's looking really good. All right. So then let's break it down a little bit into more detail here. So we've got 60% white, 60% minority, 40% white. Now, how does that break down even further? Well, our Hispanic really makes up 38%. Okay, that's pretty good. Our Black or African American makes up 20%. That's pretty good. We're a little thin on Asian and other, but on the whole, again, we've got a pretty diverse organization here. I think most people would probably be, relatively pleased with this, broad, just entire organization, demographic representation. Now, this is where it really kind of reveals itself of why we've got the pay gap problem. Okay, so now we've got that same breakdown, but we look at it now across our levels in our organization. So at the far left, we've got our executives. Then going to the right, all the pay goes down as you go to the right. So middle managers, entry managers, accountants, housekeeping, servers, groundskeepers, right? The lowest paid. Okay, so this is what we look at when we're helping organizations really understand, okay, where is their source of their pay gap, and really what can we help them do? So if you look at it, of course, these lower paying jobs, and look at the orange bar there, that is your Hispanic group of employees, right? All of your Hispanics are located in these 3 lowest paying positions, right? Now, where are all of your whites located? You guessed it, right? All of those higher paying positions. So when you just stack it all up and say, okay, what's our average white salary versus our average Hispanic salary? You see that gap, right? Obviously, your Hispanic employees are going to be, on average, making a lot less than your white employees in these higher paying positions. And so, in the executive group there, you can see there's 0 Hispanics, right? Middle managers, there's 5% Hispanic, and it gets higher as you go down. And, the goal really is to say, okay, for some of these, especially like if you looked at the junior accountant level there, you've got 20% Hispanic. Okay. So these junior accountants, these senior accountants, entry-level managers, there's a decent number of Hispanics there. How do we make that population a little bit higher? Like, how do we get more folks into that position? Because then they're in those better paying jobs, and now they can start moving up, and they'll start getting into those entry-level managers, going to get a little heavier, start getting more into the middle manager. And eventually now you've got people that are sitting there waiting to be promoted into an executive role. And when an opening comes up, now you've got some representation there, and you've got that feeder system. So really we tell people the best way to start closing this pay gap is focusing on your workforce development, frankly, training, developing, and just helping move that those bars a little bit more to the other direction, upwards into your organization in the higher paying levels. That's going to be the single best thing we can do to close the pay gap. All right. So kind of last point here before I kick it back to Julia, I want to make sure she has time for her piece. But when we look at it, there's a number of these issues that could be causing the poor distribution of people of color and diverse employees throughout your pay grades and things like that. So the first thing is going to be recruiting qualified candidates. Are you actually getting enough applicants for your jobs that are passing minimum qualifications and screening? Okay. It doesn't help to bring in a bunch of people that are not going to even make it past an initial minimum qualification screening. Okay. So recruiting them, then hiring, right? Look at your hiring practice, make sure it's not weeding people out at a disproportionate rate. We want to see everybody falling out of your hiring process at about the same rate, so that it's not like you bring in a bunch of Hispanic candidates and none of them get hired, right? Another thing, steering candidates into lower paying jobs. This is a common issue. A lot of government contractors are dealing with this issue right now, where the government's kind of looking at this and saying, okay, why is it that you're funneling all these candidates or all your employees into these lower paying jobs and they're just never getting above this certain level? Well, there's no opportunity for upward movement in some of these lower paying jobs because there's no progression. It's like the groundskeeping and server kind of concept. There's only so high you can get until you're, the senior groundskeeper. You're never going to get out of groundskeeping, right? So making sure you're getting people across in the board and they're not getting segmented into certain areas. All right. Another problem is, and for executives looking at their organization, are you devaluing Hispanic and female dominated jobs? This is a common thing that's occurred over a long time, probably the last 100 years, where again, you compare a custodian at a hotel to a housekeeping job at a hotel. They can do the same work. It's essentially the same job. One's cleaning the hotel, one's cleaning the rooms within the hotel, right? But guess what? Custodians tend to make a little bit more than housekeepers. Okay, and there's nothing but bias there. That's the devaluation of a female or Hispanic dominated role. All right, developing talent, obviously giving training opportunities for difficult assignments or challenging stretch assignments, et cetera. Promoting qualified candidates, retaining those qualified employees, and any combination of those above. There's probably others as well. But these are some difficult questions to bring back to your organization and your leadership to kind of take a look at your processes of how are you treating people as they come into and upward through your organization. All right. So Julia, I probably went long. I apologize. We're 17 minutes to the top of the hour, but I'm going to stop sharing. I'll kick it back to you and let you take over.
I'm curious if you all would post in the chat there. I'm curious to see how many of you are actually looking at statistics like what we covered, where your folks are distributed, if you've got any issues by title or by grade. If you could just post in the chat, I'd be interested in seeing how you handle that in your organization, if that's something that you're looking at. So I wanted to talk about how are positions being filled, because that sometimes is the issue. How are we going about to fill positions? So in this same example, which is a fictional company that we came out with, the way that they're looking at it externally is this is a business in the Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach area, which if you're not familiar, it's a large percentage of Hispanics. I've got a lot of relatives in that area. And we're looking at this accountants group that we were looking at. That's the skill set that you're looking for. People who have an accounting type background that have experience with that. Now, if we look at the information from the census, this is taken from the census, it's telling us that if we look at the people in the latest census that said, hey, I've got accounting background, accountant or auditor background, it's telling us that 43.5% of the people in this Miami area stated that they've got that kind of background, that they can do that job. So we would expect, if everything were the same, everything were equal, that about that percentage of Hispanics in your accounting type positions in your organization, that's the percentage that you would have employed, is what we're looking at. So in this first scenario, something in the hiring process is the issue. So here we're seeing applicants. So in blue, that's the applicants, and in the orange color, that's the hires. So we've got Hispanics that are being that are applying, quite a bit of applicants that are being that are applying, very similar to what we're seeing with whites. But as you can see, as far as hires, there's a big difference in the percentage of Hispanics being hired when compared to the number of whites that are being hired. And so these are analysis that we typically look at. So now we want to pinpoint what is the issue. Why is it that Hispanics, even though they're applying, they're not being selected? So here we're looking at what are some common dispositions that you might assign to applicants as to why they were not selected or were selected. But we're seeing here that in blue means that they did meet the basic qualifications. So we see that a lot of the Hispanics that applied did meet the basic qualifications. But then we're seeing phone screen, those that went through the phone screen, then first interview, and then personality tests that passed the personality test. So we're seeing, the issue here is the personality test. Is there something with that personality test that is disproportionately screening out Hispanics who are qualified to do the job? And are you putting a lot of weight on that personality test? So we have seen some cases. I remember Whirlpool, I have a hard time saying that word, years ago, had an issue where the personality tests for salespeople were disproportionately screening out African-American males. And so they had to, it was not a validated test that they were using for that position for their organization. And they ended up having to pay out some settlement monies and discontinue utilizing that test. In scenario 2, we have how is the organization filling the position, same issue. Here we're saying it's how they recruit. So they're recruiting from Princeton University student interns, referrals from their current senior accountants, which remember those were predominantly whites, and the local newspaper. And so now we're seeing here another picture. So we've got Princeton graduates in blue, employee referrals from senior accountants in orange, and newspaper in gray. So we're seeing that we're not getting any employee referrals, Hispanics coming through from employee referrals. And that was a recent case that we saw actually just within the last few months involving a federal contractor who they thought they weren't discriminating, but what they were doing is giving heavy weight on employee referrals to who they were going to select. And almost all the referrals that were coming through were white males. And so that caused an impact on minorities, and they were found to have to change those practices. Now, in this scenario 3, we've got senior accountants. They're being promoted from within primarily. So then we take a look at it, who do we have in line that can be promoted up to senior accountant? So if we're looking at the senior account position and we're saying, oh, so Jane Doe is able to move up, John Miller is able to move up, and Tuet Nguyen is able to move up. And we're looking at the demographic information on those people that are promotable. We're not seeing any Hispanics. So then that tells us that we need to do some things to try to recruit Hispanics into that feeder group, but also how can we develop Hispanics internally to be able to be promotable. Other factors we should consider that maybe why there's not more Hispanics in those higher paying positions: retention rates, reasons for involuntary terminations, and reasons for the voluntary terminations, things that should be reviewed. So I just want to spend a little bit of time, and please do type in the chat if you've got any tips on how you've been able to effectively attract or retain Hispanics in the workplace. We'd love to hear that. But here's just a little bit of what you can do, what I've seen organizations do well. Having diversity of people in the pictures that are showing up on their website. So if I'm applying for a job and you're only showing one race or one gender or one age group, that might tell me something about how much you value diversity in the workplace. If you've got a diversity statement, it's good to display that on your website. Readability level of the job posting refers to what grade level do I need to be at to be able to read that, understand what you wrote. So sometimes we've got a position posted for an administrative assistant position, for example, and you're not requiring a college degree, but you're writing that job description at the level of someone who's getting a PhD. So we want to make sure that we look at that. And most experts would say to try to write a job description at a sixth grade level, where someone with who has completed 6th grade would be able to understand it. Are you listing bilingual preferences if that's something that you are looking for? Maybe you've got a market, a customer, you're in an area with a lot of Hispanics, that's something that's attractive. Showcasing employee success stories if you do have diversity in your workplace. I really like enjoying going to websites and seeing actual employees, not just stock pictures, but actual employees that are sharing why they like working there. Highlighting that you've got an employee resource group, if you've got different resource groups. And I'd love to hear from you if any of you have a Hispanic resource group or multicultural resource group at your organization. And then listing the outreach that you're doing in your communities is also very good. And then targeted recruiting. So if we're looking to try to increase the number of Hispanics that are filling these accounting positions, just know, you could go to LinkedIn or you can go to Google and you can find tons of different groups out there, associations that are appropriate or focus on a particular group. So these are just some examples. There's a lot more in different areas depending what you're looking for. But here, for example, American Association of Hispanic Certified Public Accountants, or Association of Latino Professionals in Finance and Accounting. So if you're trying to find Hispanics with those qualifications to do accounting work, that's an excellent way to go. Maybe even internships with Hispanic serving institutions. So you might not be familiar with that terminology, but that's telling us that at least 25% of the full-time students enrolled at that university have identified as being Hispanic. And so that's something that you might consider doing. And then as far as hiring, just to increase the likelihood of bias not being an indicator of who you select, I always think it's a good idea to have a diverse group of people from different ages, different gender, race, etc., as much as possible to be part of the group that's deciding who they're going to hire, who's doing the interviewing. And then making sure that you ask the same questions of the applicants. I remember consulting with a company one time, and the government came in to do an audit, and they found that everybody from one group was being asked the easy questions, and everyone from the underrepresented group was being asked the tough questions. And it wasn't that the underrepresented group wasn't qualified, it was that they didn't score as high in the interview because of the questions being asked, and that had a discriminatory impact. We also want to review the job qualifications to make sure that they're accurate for the job, what you really need the person to do. Sometimes you say you need a bachelor's degree or 10 years of experience when you really don't need that to be able to do the essential job duties. And that could be screening out a lot of qualified people from being considered. And you want to run the analysis to make sure why candidates aren't being hired, and then investigate that to see, is there a manager who's got biases, or what's causing that? Is it a test that's causing us to screen out these people disproportionately? So I love this. You might have heard this already from Andres Tapia. Diversity is a mix, and inclusion is making the mix work. So it's one thing to focus your attention to draw Hispanics or minorities or women or whatever group that may be into the workplace. But what are we doing to create an environment where they feel included, where they feel like they belong? So that's really important. Well, some things that you could do is developing your employees. Are you giving employees the opportunity to be able to be promotable, to be able to do well in their job? So things like mentoring, job shadowing or sharing, well, they can learn different types of tasks, being able to promote them, or transfer them into departments or locations that have more opportunities for advancement and experience, allowing them to take part in conferences, training, webinars, so that they can develop skills and meet other people that share some examples of how they can do their job well. And then tuition reimbursement, if you offer that, so that they can get some training to do well, some education there. And then as far as advancing, a lot of these things are similar. Mentoring, job shadowing, job sharing can help someone to become advanceable. Posting jobs internally. I can't tell you how many organizations don't do that. So a lot of times employees don't find out that there's an opening that they're qualified to apply for, because no one's ever mentioned to the employees that, hey, we're posting this position. Are you interested in applying? Reaching out to employee resource groups. I've been involved with several, and they're a wonderful resource to try to get out there and to get their ideas of who might be interested in these positions, who might be interested in being mentored. And again, the last two are similar to what we just talked about for employees. And then here, collaboration, creativity, and respect build lifelong connections that matter and make a difference, propelling us to work together across all boundaries. I love that quote from Diane Luna. Some things about retaining. So what can we do to retain customers? So review reasons why they're leaving. Sometimes it's because they feel like they're not appreciated. They're being passed up for promotions. That gives you a lot of valuable information that you should take seriously. Look at employee satisfaction surveys. I'd be interested in hearing, are any of you doing any type of kind of climate survey at your organizations? And then providing employee incentives to refer friends and family, providing regular feedback on performance. So someone knows how they're doing. They want to know the good and the bad, but how can I improve? And what do I need to do so that I can move to the next level? Celebrating cultural events. So this, Hispanic national awareness in your organization, and inviting employees to share about their culture. So I think it's always a good opportunity to increase understanding in the organization. It's not just about eating tacos. I know every time I would go out to eat and we would go to a Mexican restaurant, I love Mexican restaurant, people would ask me about the menu and what does this mean? And I have to explain, that's not the kind of food that you find in Cuba and Spain, but I can tell you a little bit about it because I frequent these restaurants. But people assume that because I'm Hispanic, we all eat the same type of food, and nothing could be farther from the truth there. Including diversity in pictures posted throughout the facilities, that's important. I've been to sites where all I saw were white males in the pictures that were posted. I mean, that sets the tone for your organization. So something you should look at. Again, sharing those success stories about Hispanics and starting up or promoting a Hispanic employee resource group. And then lastly, training. I believe a lot about unconscious bias training, microaggressions, and respect. A lot of times people are hurt or offend one another because they just don't understand that what they're saying is hurtful. And so I think that it goes a lot to having honest, respectful conversations, and to be patient as people learn more about the culture is important. So in your handouts, you're going to see some upcoming webinars that we are offering, and they're all free of charge. So we invite you to go to that. And on your handouts, you're going to get information about how you can reach the two of us. But I wanted to stop sharing here to see if anyone's got any questions. We would love to answer your questions or any feedback. Is there anything that you're doing at your organization that is working to try to help attract or retain or advance Hispanics? I'd love to hear.
Julia, before we get into
Yes.
Q&A, I just want
Yes.
to take a quick picture really quickly.
Oh, absolutely.
So everyone can come off camera really quick, we can take this picture and we can post it on the website. All right, so it's gonna be, let me see if I can remember how to do this. All right, 1, 2, 3. Uh-oh, I didn't do it, hold on. I see someone trying to come off camera. Okay, all ready? 1, 2, 3, cheese.
Cheese.
All right, we're gonna go to the second page. All right, anybody else would like to come off camera, take a picture? Okay, I see some more people coming off.
My camera's not allowing me to be great.
1, 2, 3, cheese. All right, thank you.
Awesome.
All right, if anyone have any questions for Julia, you can go ahead and start asking the questions.
Okay, is anybody to increase the recruiting and the retention effort? At my company, one of the things that we have realized we had to do is obviously create a baseline. So we have been working with PwC to look at our data analysis and actually assess the Latin population, Blacks and Asians. It was very telling, the data that we saw. So basically on that, that was our first step, just to kind of create a strategy around what it is. But I think it was so telling that the group executives are now bought in that we need some funding to do these efforts.